Such an important question. Thank you all for that. Has anybody asked you lately if you're okay? Have you asked anyone if they are okay? I don't think I've asked it very much lately because I'm afraid of the answer sometimes. And I will admit, sitting there and listening to this was very emotional for me, as it may have been for you. We're living in a it's not okay time. And the weight of that on us is almost too much to bear. And when I say that, I think of all of the people, both here in LA and across the US, who are not okay. I think about the people in Gaza who are not okay. And I think about what is ours to do within this time. So this morning we start out with a title that I really didn't use much of in the sermon because I just thought it was too much of a downer. You know, the idea of how to be untroubled. Doesn't that sound just like a little bit of a joke right now, right? Seems a little hard to just be untroubled. But as I started writing over the last few days, I started thinking about a time long ago and far away in another life when, quite honestly, I was not okay. I spent a lot of my time in those days on airplanes. And imagine, if you will, some of you can't imagine this, I know. In those days, there were no iPads, there were no laptops, and there were no cell phones. So hard to imagine. So while I would always work on long flights, I never allowed myself, I did allow myself, boy, let's get this right. So while I would work on long flights, I also allowed myself the luxury of sitting in a seat all by myself with no one who knew me. And I would read newspapers and, yes, magazines. I spent a lot of money at those stores in the airport before you get on the plane. And don't judge me, but my favorites were Vogue and Time magazine at that point. And those two could keep me occupied for a very long time. More importantly, though, for me and what has happened to me in the years forward is that it was during that time that my love affair with the New York Times began in earnest. On one very long flight, after I had exhausted all of my other sources, my eyes were so tired that I was actually just skimming the Times. Now, remember, it was not on my iPad. It was the big newspaper that you had to fold 9 million times and keep folding and get out and take another part. It was not always good for the person seated next to you on the plane. So after I had exhausted all those other sources and I was just skimming the Times, suddenly on the top corner of an inside page, there magically appeared an ad for a Mont Blanc pen. It caught my eye not because I wanted a Mont Blanc pen, because seriously, who in the world pays that much money for a pen? And while, yes, the pen was responsible for catching my attention, it was the very short quote by George Eliot that I had never seen before, that truly felt like a divine intervention. The quote simply said, "It is never too late to be who you might have been." Perhaps you've always known who you wanted to be and where you wanted to go in life, and perhaps you have stayed on that path without any detours. Or perhaps your path has been more like mine. You may have known, sort of, who you wanted to be, but you may have taken a lot of detours along the way. Or perhaps you are still searching. Whatever stage of life you find yourself in, and even though it may be far away from the places of your dreams, George Eliot tells you it is never too late. The stories of the disciple Peter in the Gospels have always intrigued me. Peter is front and center in these narratives, and yet we really know very little about him. In the early parts of his life, Peter might have dreamed of fishing for a living. He might have inherited the family business, or maybe fishing was his only choice, since he lived in the midst of the chaos of the Roman occupation of his homeland. All Peter had ever known was this occupation, and he knew that life was hard, and he knew it was unpredictable. So when Jesus appeared on the scene and gave Peter the chance to step into a new way of life, Peter leapt at the opportunity to follow the one whose life changed the future. It is difficult for us to even imagine what that must have felt like for Peter and for many others who decided to follow without knowing where they were going. In the gospel reading today, we find Peter at what certainly seemed to be for him the end of the road. The one he followed had been arrested and was now facing execution. And Peter found him in this place Jesus had warned him about. Peter's story can be a harsh story, and it is often read by us with a great deal of judgment. In this story, none of us wants to be Peter. But these days, as I am reading these chapters of the Gospel of Mark, I am seeing them very differently than I ever have before. I used to read them assuming that Jesus was terribly disappointed with his followers, surprised and disappointed. These days, as I read the text, I believe Jesus had come to know the followers so well that he was able to understand what they would do when the chaos erupted and they were definitely not okay. He knew Judas would turn him in to the authorities, and he knew that act would ultimately lead to death for both of them, I believe. He knew Peter would deny ever knowing him and then would experience the deepest regret. He knew the Apostle Mary Magdalene would never leave his side. Jesus knew what each one of them would do in those chaotic and impossible times when they were not okay. And Jesus loved them anyway. Jesus knew who Peter was, and he knew Peter would survive when the world fell apart. He knew Peter would be eventually able to go in a new direction, a direction that would change not only Peter's life, but the lives of people throughout the ages. Jesus had predicted early on that Peter would become the rock on which the future would be built. The Buddhist teacher, Pema Chodron, reminds us that no matter our age, circumstances, or past mistakes, it is never too late to change our path, to open our hearts, and begin again. The notion of starting right where we are is absolutely central to this process. We do not and cannot wait for better times or circumstances. Spiritual transformation and emotional healing are always available in this present moment. Chodron says, first of all, we must embrace self-compassion. And we must release the shame or regret that keeps us stuck. We do not need to be perfect to grow and begin again. We only need to be willing. Every moment of our lives offers a multitude of chances to choose kindness, to choose being present, and to choose courage. Transformation can begin in this very moment. One of the hardest things for me to learn was to let go of regret. I should say, one of the hardest things for me to learn is to continue letting go of regret. It is not a one and done. Holding on to our past mistakes, I have learned, only deepens our suffering. It is forgiveness of ourselves that opens our hearts. We have to let go of regret and find compassion for ourselves as our foundation. Kindness towards ourselves, children, says, is not indulgent. Some of us were raised to believe that's true. It is, though, essential for meaningful change. And while we believe that changes have to be all or nothing, small shifts matter. Even the smallest acts of awareness or kindness contain the possibility of creating new life. Children also insist we have to be willing. Being open to change, even without knowing how or where we're going or how we're going to change, invites the grace of the divine into our lives. In her teaching across the world, she has shown countless people how we can use our difficulties and our problems to awaken our hearts. She believes no matter where we are or what time it is in the world, it is in this moment that we have to change. And she insists that this moment is the perfect teacher. And that when we feel like running, we must learn to lean into the pain, the hurt, and the discomfort. Because she is such a powerful teacher of heart-based living, one of her core teachings is that true compassion does not come from simply wanting to help out those who are in more need than we are. That's tough for me because I spent a lot of years believing that was the key. Rather, she says it comes from realizing our kinship with all beings. It comes when we discover our oneness with the entire world, not just those we might decide are worthy. As a community of faith, we are justice seekers. We see the suffering of others and we want to take it head on. This is one of the things that I love most about being able to do life together. And yet, Children advises that before we take on the suffering of others, we must develop compassion for our own wounds. The interconnectedness of these two ways is essential to becoming who we truly are. Sometimes wounded people wound other people without knowing, simply because we haven't faced our own pain. And this idea can really be hard for many of us to grasp because we are so busy running around serving everyone else in the world. We forget how vital our own well-being is for us and for those who need our help. Embodying this knowledge and living out our unconditional compassion for ourselves will naturally lead to unconditional compassion for others. If we can be willing to stand fully in our own shoes and never give up on ourselves, then we will be able to put ourselves in the shoes of others and never give up on them. So there hasn't been homework, I don't think, for the last couple weeks, has there? So this week, the homework comes from a teacher who learned from Pema Chodron. And while this homework may not be the easiest thing we have ever done, the idea of doing it might be harder than the actual practice. This week, you are invited to forgive yourself for one mistake you have made this year. One mistake. And there is no need for you to go back in the archives of your mistakes from the beginning. You only need one mistake from this year. It is paramount that as you embrace this process, you must treat yourself gently. Feel free to choose a really big mistake or a little tiny mistake. You simply need to choose one thing you have been beating yourself up over, and then act kindly and lovingly to yourself in the hours and days of this next week. In these days of chaos, when it takes a lot to admit we're not okay, is it really possible for us to do this? Can we love ourselves just a little bit more this week? I hope so. And as we practice loving ourselves more, the next step is to finally forgive ourselves. This prescription says, give yourself a second chance or a third chance, or as my mother was fond of saying, forgive yourself for the 300th time. The promise of the teacher is that this is where the possibility for an incredible experience is able to unfold. And this experience, I promise, will only be the first of many. If Peter had stayed stuck because of his fear, his anger, or his shame, he would never have become the Apostle Peter. And all the goodness he brought to the early church would not have happened. We see, though, through the writings of the first century, that Peter still dealt with fear, anger, and shame throughout his life. But he did not let the past stop him from becoming who he needed to be. Peter came to believe and to know that it is possible to die to the past and step into the now. When we can take this step, our lives and love will also become true. Our hearts will expand as well as our ability to have compassion for ourselves. I know I'm trying to make it sound easier than it really is. And yet we can begin this morning by coming to this table just as we are. In the beginning, Chad invited us to bring many things into this space. And this morning, we are reminded that we can bring our pain, our regrets, our sorrows, and our hopes for ourselves, for each other, and for our world. In the days to come, may we find ways to share this path with those who are hungry and thirsty for the love and acceptance of the Holy One, and for the love and acceptance of us. And may the impact of our changed lives and compassion ripple out into the world, creating new streams of life and of light. Amen and amen.